last year, Venerable Sepul taught a series of talks on the text Transforming Problems into Happiness by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And I found these teachings incredibly beneficial for my mind, and have been thinking about them since then. And especially, it's a book that's a commentary on another text, a much shorter text, called Transforming Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment by Thubten Jigme Tempa Nima. And this is a text that I keep going back to again and again. It's very short, and it just explains how to take suffering onto the path so incredibly clearly. So I have found myself, whenever I'm unhappy or there's some problem, I just read this text. So I wanted to do a little bit of a Cliff Notes version of it, because I've been doing this in my practice and it's been incredibly helpful recently. So the text starts with this section called Dropping the Attitude of Being Entirely Unwilling to Suffer. So this is basically accepting suffering. And he says that it's useless to see suffering as unfavorable. It's true. And he takes a lot of what he says from Shantideva. He's very much inspired by Shantideva. And so we all know the verse in Shantideva where Shantideva is saying that if you can do something about a problem, why be unhappy about it? Just do it. And if you can't do something about a problem, again, why be unhappy? It doesn't help to be unhappy. So I've heard this advice over and over again, and sometimes I can't quite get it. It's like, well, yes, but if it were that easy to do, then I wouldn't be unhappy. And what I've thought about was, first, okay, if there is something to do externally, we do it, but we need to check our motivation for why we're doing it and make sure that whatever external change we're trying to implement is in alignment with the Dharma. And the other thing to do is, often I hear this advice and I think, oh, well, that means I can change something outside of myself. But actually the thing I need to change is right here. I need to change my mental state. So when I keep these in mind about doing external things in alignment with the Dharma and primarily changing my mental state, then this advice makes so much sense. The other aspect of dropping this attitude of being entirely unwilling to suffer is seeing suffering as unfavorable causes trouble. Yes, it does. And he says if our mind is dominated by negativity, then even tiny problems become extremely difficult. Yes, they do. I will say in my life, I have experienced very little physical suffering. I've been extremely fortunate in that regard. And my suffering has primarily been mental and essentially just my mind being untamed, uncontrolled. Taking these teeny tiny little things that anyone who looks at my life from the outside would say, that's not a thing at all. That's not a big deal. That's not even a deal. What's your problem? My problem is my uncontrolled mind. I take ownership of that. And so basically to ask ourselves, like, am I making this worse by ruminating on it, by bringing it up in my mind daily? You know, because I do that with some tiny problems I have. And just to really see, is this causing me trouble? Is this exacerbating the problems that I have? Okay, so that's the first section about accepting suffering, being willing to suffer. The next step, which is a little more advanced or a lot advanced, is cultivating the attitude of being joyful when suffering arises. So we know Lama Zopa Rinpoche is a fan of this and has done this. So the author here talks about ways in which we can bring suffering into the path. And he gives 7 specific practices to do. And I love it. It's so clear, and he says exactly what to do in each one of these. So I'm not going to just read the text. We can put the link to the text in the description of this. But essentially, when I looked at this, it's essentially interweaving our suffering with the Lam Rim. And many of the topics in the Lam Rim are included here. And so I reordered them a little bit to sort of follow the Lam Rim outline. And basically, the first step, from my perspective, is to overcome the arrogance that thinks we're in control, that thinks we can control what happens to us and how we feel about it, and to say, well, actually, no, I'm not in control of the situation, and I'm definitely not in control of my mind. So that overcomes arrogance. And then the next is, once we're not so arrogant, thinking we can control things, then seeing that we need help. And where do we get help but from the Buddha Dharma Sangha? So that's taking refuge. So seeing that the only thing reliable in my life is the Buddha Dharma Sangha. And so I want to follow the Dharma. The next is seeing that suffering comes from negativity. Then we want to purify our negativity. So this encourages us to do purification. The next is seeing that happiness comes from virtue. Then we want to do virtue. And when we recognize that this suffering that I'm experiencing right now, this is just the nature of samsara. There's nothing special about me or about this particular way that I'm feeling. This is simply the nature of things. And so then we can really generate this heartfelt wish to get out of this situation that we're in, this uncontrolled situation of experiencing unsatisfactoriness and pain. And so generating renunciation and the determination to be free. And then seeing that, okay, I'm suffering now, but others are just like me in suffering, so we generate compassion. And then seeing that, as we all know, that our suffering comes from self-cherishing, self-centeredness. And so to see that cherishing others is really the antidote to that. So that's the whole Lam Rim, taking our suffering onto the path. I was thinking that this is in the genre of thought transformation. And I was thinking that thought transformation makes absolutely no sense when we're clinging to worldly goals, right? When we still are caught up in the 8 worldly concerns, then these really are problems because they're blocking me from having possessions and getting a good reputation and having someone praise me and getting comfort. But when we switch our orientation and start looking at things from the perspective of, what do I want spiritually? Well, I want to cultivate the causes for a good rebirth. I want to generate renunciation. I want to generate bodhicitta, progress along the path. When that's our orientation, then the same situation is not a problem, right? So it's a matter of orientation. And I was also thinking that for these really to be effective, we really have to understand why this particular issue is beneficial, right? This is the whole key to thought training, is changing our perspective, seeing that what we were considering to be a problem is actually helpful to us. So some of the ways that some of the unhelpful mental states and the pain caused by those are helpful is that they keep me interested in spiritual practice and curious about how my mind is thinking. You know, if I have some mental unhappiness, I'm thinking, I am not thinking clearly. I'm not thinking correctly in this moment. So I stay curious about what's going on. It gives me a lot of energy, as I'm experiencing right now, to do the same practice and the same antidote daily, every day coming back to this antidote, because I know this is what I need. And so I have this energy. It's like, oh yeah, this caused me suffering yesterday. I'm really enthusiastic about cultivating the antidote, do it today, and just keep doing that. And it really opens my heart, and I can see, I don't have equanimity, but it opens my heart to those who are suffering in the same kinds of ways. I can see that there's like this heart connection, like, oh, I know what that's like. And so the author here says there's a few ways in order to do this, to engage in these kinds of practices. One, and this is things we've all heard before, we need to make it familiar. So we need to engage in these prior to the problem. So I've made this mistake for a year, basically coming to this text only when I had an active problem. And so recently I've been just reviewing it constantly before something more major arises. Also, a key component to this is he calls it appreciation of our achievement. So when we recognize that we turned our mind, to rejoice in that. In my last BBC, I talked about my daily practice of rejoicing, and I'm finding it extremely beneficial just to keep my mind uplifted. And he gives this very cute, sweet analogy. He says, this is a paraphrase, but that when we engage in this practice, it's bitter yet sweet, like the Indian cakes made with sugar mixed with cardamom and pepper. And that to me is like, oh, I want to eat that. I actually did look online for recipes. I think it's cardamom cake, and some contain black pepper. But it's, yeah, our problems, they are difficult, they are bitter. But when we take them into the path, they become sweet. And then finally, to practice in a gradual way. So to take the little sufferings and then progress to the bigger ones. And he recommends that we actually pray to be able to take on suffering. So that's the first step. The second step is much more difficult, to pray to receive misfortune. I'm not there yet, but I can definitely pray to be able to bear with whatever I am encountering. And I was also thinking that these are quite realistic prayers, right? If we pray for misfortune, it'll come. So, and I also was thinking that having a problem daily, even if it's very small, it's quite beneficial because you can daily work on it, right? You can apply these teachings to it every single day. So by the end of this text, basically, so I'll just say that the text talks about, as the title indicates, transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment. Although it's very interesting, he spends most of the text talking about transforming suffering into enlightenment and very little about happiness. But in the end of this section on transforming suffering into the path, basically the key takeaway is to stop looking at difficult circumstances as problems and to make every effort to view them as beneficial, which I think was the takeaway of the teachings by Lama Zopa and the book by Lama Zopa, Transforming Problems into Happiness. So this is the key point. And how do we do that? It's by turning our perspective to a Dharma lens and then viewing that situation from that perspective. And I just want to conclude with what he says about this practice. He says, to follow a spiritual path in this degenerate age, We cannot be without armor of this kind. So this is our real armor that will protect us from everything that's happening, both externally and internally. And this was true more than 100 years ago when he wrote this text, and it's very true now.